uh, we always start out with, why do we care about this stuff? And I'm not a big fan of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which seems to be what a lot of presentations are all about. But the interesting thing is that we at BitSight, so what we do is we actually measure cybersecurity from outside organizations, and we rate it on basically a consumer credit model. So basically, if you're looking at a company and you say, well, how good is their security posture? 250 is horrible, 900 is awesome. And we do that by looking at different pieces of information. So we intercept botnet traffic, and we determine whether or not they're infected. We look at things like whether or not there's BitTorrenting activity. We look at publicly disclosed breaches. We look at basic hygiene stuff. So, how is SSL configuration? Do they have open ports that are dangerous? We look at things like, are their systems patched? And we do that not just from external systems. We can actually see beyond the firewall a little bit, because when people connect to websites, they'll also get ads from ad exchanges. And ad exchanges capture the user agent string from the browser, and that can give us information about the operating system and the browser version that's being used. So we can tell a lot of stuff from the outside. It's actually fairly surprising. But what we did is we did this study because we were kind of curious how that was going to affect both our data and for how organizations are going to be affected by COVID-19. And so we looked at 41,000 organizations, and we found that 84% of them actually, of education, shifted off network. We'll see what happens here in the next month, right? That's going to be interesting. 63% of government and politics and 35% of finance shifted off network. So it's kind of interesting. It changes the calculus, and it changes the way that a lot of our customers and a lot of the people that I just talked to who aren't BitSight customers are looking at changing how they need to track their employees. So for example, most of us are at home right now, we're on cable modems or Fios or whatever it is. Our kids, if we have them, or our spouses they're browsing the internet, they've got their own computers. Who knows what their hygiene is? I don't have kids, but I try to tell my wife what's good and bad, and she seems pretty good about it. But to some extent, I trust what she does. But I imagine if you have kids, you probably have a lot of infections. And in addition, the kids know how to do things like manage home office networks. So who knows what the hygiene is of where you currently are. Whereas when you're in the office, the corporate network, you have an IT staff who's governing, the activities. So what we did find from doing a study, by the way, though, is that 61.2% of work from home or remote offices actually have some sort of exposed cable modem interface. What that means is there's a protocol that the ISPs, whether it's Comcast or whoever it is that you use, that manage your cable modem. And presumably they would be restricted to their core, to your home premise, and not available from the internet. But we found that 61.2% are actually available from the internet. So people can actually potentially take over the cable modems. I think more disturbing to me was 9.5%-ish of cable modems actually have the administrative interface, usually from HTTP or HTTPS, exposed to the internet. And we don't test passwords and things like that. That borders on the illegal. Actually, I don't think it borders. I think it is illegal. But presumably a lot of them are fairly easy to guess. So kind of an interesting way to look at it, that your employees are working at home and about 10% of them may have a fairly exposed firewall or router. So just sort of an interesting thing to think about. The other thing that kind of came out of the study is that Gartner estimates that there's going to be a 6.7 billion decrease because of furloughs and cut budgets and things like that when it comes to cybersecurity, or I think overall, I think they're talking about IT staff. But we in cyber know that, at least for the last 20 years, I could say, I have never met an organization that said, hey, we got all the resources we need. We got the budget, we got the staff, we're done. It's all great. So now we're going to be cut even leaner at this point. So what that means is we need to be a little bit smarter. We need to do more with less. And we need to automate when possible and use threat intelligence to help to determine where to focus attention. So how can you do that? So the big thing is, how do you, well, forget the slide. You guys can read the slide. Here's the way that I look at the world. is that most organizations that I've dealt with over the last 35 years pretty much manage their infrastructure through security controls. So, there's been, firewalls were the big thing 20 years ago, and, hard, crunchy outside, soft, chewy center, if anybody remembers those days. And then, we transitioned to IPS, and then, then there was defense in depth, and now we're talking about application firewalls and things like that. So, side story, by the way, and Donna, you'll appreciate this. One of the first events that I did with Donna, way back, 11 years ago. I can't believe we've known each other that long.
I know, it's scary when you say it.
It is, and you look just as young as you did back then, darling. So Nir Zook, who is from Palo Alto Networks, he's the founder, was there, and he gets up in front of the audience and he goes, "Okay, who here has a firewall?" Everybody raised their hand, and Nir goes, "Firewalls are shit." And then he goes, "Okay, now who here has IPS?" Everybody raised their hand. He goes, "IPS is shit." And then he starts talking about application firewalls. And so he gets off the stage, and I go, "Nir, you were employee number 6 at Checkpoint, a firewall company. You were the founder of OneSecure, an IPS company. How long before you get on stage and you go, 'Who here has application firewall? Application firewalls are shit.'" To which he just gave me the typical Nir Zook sneer and just walked away. He was not amused by that. So what I take away from that is everything keeps evolving, and even if you were invested in something prior to, the next big thing is what people sort of focus on. And it's all about controls a lot of times. So the way that I look at it is controls are awesome. You need them, obviously. But when you start looking at things from the outside, what's the effect, right? So for example, things like asset inventory. Do you actually have a good asset inventory about everything that's in your infrastructure, particularly things that are outside? And also because the boundaries are now completely changing, right? Cloud changed the calculus, right? So now a lot of stuff is in the cloud. Nobody's HR is in-house anymore, at least not the management of it. Payroll, we look at all kinds of things that are outsourced now. And a lot of our infrastructure is outside. Our direct control, right? So it's kind of interesting when you start thinking about where all your assets are. And if you look at, for example, the CIS critical controls, the top 20, used to be the SANS top 20. Number 1 is know where all your hardware assets are. Number 2 are know where all your software assets are. I have yet to encounter an organization that has a full living asset inventory. I should qualify that. Any organization that's enterprise class, so 5,000 employees or above or whatever. So it's a super hard thing to do. And so everyone should expect that there is a little bit of failure, right? That there's going to be some gaps. But what you can do is you can test for those gaps, right? And then start to address and prioritize where you see those control gaps, which might be adding those assets to your asset inventory. It might be adding new controls. It might just be saying we accept that risk and we're going to put that under a little bit more incident detection and response scrutiny, so that when we do see the indication that there might be some sort of attack or even a successful compromise, that we are on top of it and we take care of it as soon as possible. So ultimately, what ends up happening is that you're accountable for the outcomes of your cybersecurity programs. If you're the CISO, you're basically just, you're a sacrificial lamb a lot of times. But you really do need to continuously measure. And that's something we're really bad at doing in cybersecurity. We're good at monitoring, we're decent at managing, and improving, hard to say, it depends upon the organization. But ultimately, what we call that is security performance management, or SPM, at BitSight. And I've heard some of the analysts start to use that terminology as well. So, excuse me, 1 second. So one of the things that we do is we take all this data. We've been gathering a bunch of data for 9 years, and we continue to. We do it independently of the organizations. We're just saying, okay, we see botnet activity from these IP addresses. We see certificates on these systems that are expired or have weak controls or whatever, weak encryption. So we gather all that data, and then we also separately will footprint organizations. And we have beyond the scope of this, but we have a team of 70 people, and that's their full-time job. And they use automation, but they also manually curate that stuff. Then we sort of jam those two things together and go, here's the footprint, here's the findings. Oh, so this organization has botnets. They've been sending out spam. They're using BitTorrent, and we see that they're using it to download pirated applications. We see things like open ports. They've got unauthenticated VNC or whatever it happens to be. We see IoT devices. So all of those, I'm sure the organizations that we met, and by the way, we percolate this up to while we give grades in those specific areas, things like desktop software and open ports and all that, we also percolate it up to an overall rating that's a culmination of all these observations. Again, on that 250 to 900 score, we normalize it across size of organizations, because one of the things that you should be able to do as a platform is say, we're looking at a huge company, like let's pick IBM, just because I used to work there. And let's pick a small company, like 2 people in Palo Alto they have a startup in a garage. And you should be able to say, this one has a 500, this one has a 700, and be able to compare them apples to apples, regardless of their size. So there is some normalization there. So all of these risk vectors we call these risk vectors, get percolated up to that rating, and you should be able to go, they've got a really bad security posture, and they have a really good security posture. So the reason for doing that is so that we can say, we understand that your program is not perfect. We're helping you to determine where we see gaps. But these observations can also tell you where there are program policy and procedure failures on the back end. So a good example of that is web application headers, or excuse me, well, that's a good one actually. So if we see poor web application headers, it means that they're not following OWASP top 10 guidance, for example. And it may also be that there are multiple development organizations, and there's no consolidated training effort, no consolidated standards. So we're looking at things not just at the outcome, which is the symptom, but also how do we identify root cause? Where is there a policy and program and process failure? So you can go to that organization, particularly if they're a third party, a vendor of yours, and say, what are you doing about web application headers? So an interesting example is if I'm working with a SaaS provider, they should be insanely good at TLS, SSL certificates, configuring TLS and SSL for web servers and mail and FTP and things like that. They should be really good at writing good web applications. They should be great at managing their server software, and they should be great at patching. So when I'm working with a SaaS provider, I want to see A's and B's in all of these categories. And if I don't, I want to reach out to them and have a conversation and say, why? What are you doing? What is your program? Give me some sort of audit results. Let me do an on-site or nowadays remote audit of your environment. So it's actually an indicator of whether or not that vendor is doing well. You can also apply it to yourself, again, because now you're looking at, okay, we think we've got everything covered, but we're seeing some external evidence that maybe our program isn't operating the way we think it is. So it really is about data-driven decisions. So for example, with patching, well, we're not saying we're going to look at every system you have and say they're all up to date. What we do is we look at specific vulnerabilities. So for example, the Citrix ADC vulnerability, which is pretty severe. In fact, I can't remember who just got hit with a breach as a consequence of that. It's escaping me at the moment. But what we can say is we're looking at about 2,000 different severe vulnerabilities. And then we're looking at different systems that are exposed, and we're determining whether or not they're vulnerable to those. We're not really concerned about the comprehensiveness, but what we're saying here is we're looking at how long it takes that organization to patch those vulnerabilities. So for example, you can see in the bottom of this, that CVE 2019-19781, which is the Citrix ADC. This organization was vulnerable for over a year and didn't patch it until 10/29/2019. This is a little bit older slide, but pretend this was 8/26/2020. So basically what we're saying is it took them a year to patch that vulnerability, which is not a very good track record, right? So it's the same thing with you. So one of two things are happening as a consequence of this. If you're looking at your own organization, we're not saying go patch this. I mean, you should. But what we're saying is what's happening with your patching program that you missed this severe vulnerability for a year? Is it that do you not have a good asset inventory? Do you not know about this system? Is your patching program just not functioning appropriately? Is this a new acquisition that you just made and they're not very good, even though you from the acquiring company are doing a good job? Is it a system that that runs an industrial control platform that you can't patch because it's so old? So there's a lot of ways to look at this, but at least the ability to say, we have problems, where are those problems, and how do we address them, both at the tactical level and at the root cause. The other thing to look at it from is, can we show you what your footprint is? So for example, I was working with a state agency in the US, obviously, and one of the things that one of the reasons they talked to us is because they had their voting machines in this, this co-location facility. And, you know, they had vetted out the co-lo facility as a vendor and all that. And then about a year and a half in, all of a sudden this newspaper article came out that said state of X, voting machines are under the control of the Russian government. And what it turned out is that the facility that was being used had been purchased by a company whose was headquartered in Russia. So, you know, as usual, the news was a little bit hyperbolic, but the point of the matter is, you know, you look at things from the perspective of, where are your vendors' assets? Where are your assets from a geographic perspective? A lot of times looking at it graphically can give people a sense of where there might be, you know, some risk or even shadow IT. We can also look at things like which particular cloud providers we see your assets in. You know, so do you think you have things in AWS and Azure? Fine. Did you know you have things in Rackspace? Or do you know you have stuff in OVH, a French hosting company? So those kind of things are super important. And also by prioritizing what we think the asset's criticality is from the outside. You know, so in this particular example here, you can see that, you know, we can say that an asset that's important is actually in AWS, and maybe your policy says that anything that has PII or PCI cardholder data, HIPAA data, any data that's under healthcare governance, cannot be homed in AWS, or it has to be in specific AWS instance that is only, the systems are only housed within the continental US, so they don't go outside of the country. So your data stays within the continental US. So there's a lot of ways to slice and dice this data. It's super important. So the other thing that we show, and just to dig a little bit deeper into this asset matrix, if you see this here, is, again, sort of prioritizing the assets in terms of importance. And we do that by looking at the amount of traffic to that asset, whether or not it has a login page, which implies that there's something important back there, although it might be just a login page for me to download a report. I hate paywalls or login walls, but it could be there. But we also look for extended validation certificates, which may not mean that I've had debates about people whether EVs are actually, whether they improve security. But if somebody takes the time and effort and spends the money to get an EV, it's a pretty good chance that they're protecting something important. So there's asset criticality, and then there's the type of findings we find, right? So it helps you to look at your assets from the perspective of, this is a heat map. Instead of looking at thousands of assets, there's only 498 findings, and then you can drill down and find that they only exist on 60 different assets. So that's where your effort, your time, effort, and money is best spent, is dealing with those assets first, and then you can expand your aperture so that you gauge your efforts based upon the amount of resources that you have at your disposal. And you can also see things like which infections are inherent, which assets they're on, what vulnerabilities are out there, as I pointed out. So there's a lot of ways to pivot through this data and decide how to prioritize. As I pointed out, there are ways to look at it from assets. So on the left-hand side, everything rolls up to, for example, 192, 199, 225.10. We think that's a critical asset based upon everything I just told you. There are 309 material and severe findings out of a total of 417. Some are good. And it's within a particular subsidiary. So think about a large organization that might have, you know, multiple operating business units. So we can point out which business unit is actually operating, which is causing the most risk. Another interesting feature here is if you look a little bit to the left of the asset where the IP address is, there's a little Wi-Fi signal. We actually pick up on Wi-Fi SSIDs as well. So we can tell you which SSIDs are behind the firewall for that particular IP address. And I'm sure somebody will have a question, but so I'll wait until somebody does ask me about that, how we do it. But it gives you sort of a sense of being able to prioritize. So again, I'm going to focus my attention on the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, maybe 10 assets here, right? because they all have at least 3 material or severe findings. So again, stretching your budget. I talked a little bit about work from home, but we also give you the ability to take the IP addresses from your work from home employees, which you can get from VPN concentrators by running things like endpoint agents, which can run applets or things like that. So Big Fix, or I can't remember what the newest one is, but you can run that kind of stuff and sort of get that information. You can plug it into our platform and we'll tell you whether or not there's been any botnet infections, whether there are any other inherent risks, whether the cable modem actually has a report on it, things like that. So you can start to extend your visibility beyond your existing controls. As well as see, for example, which desktops are up to date, which ones are out of date, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, as you kind of, being able to manage it operationally is important, but also the other side of the coin is being able to message up to the executive level, right? So one of the things is being able to determine how you actually are faring compared to your peers. So peer analytics is one of the big things that boards care about. So if you look at the top here, we're basically saying your particular group, this company called Cybersecurity, is in the bottom 5%. Probably not a graph that you want to show to your board until you get your security posture up to snuff. Although I will tell you that you can actually slice and dice the data a little bit by changing the industry that you believe you're in and stuff like that. And there's a great book out there called How to Lie with Statistics. So highly recommend, if you ever report to the board, go get that book. It'll make you look like a hero. You'll be in great shape. So we can help you to do that, compare against your peers, as well as decide how much effort by using a forecasting tool and say, how much of an improvement can I have over my security program if I change these things? So now you can sort of say, these are the things that matter the most. I'm going to spend some time and effort. Go to the board and say that we're going to go from bottom 5% to at least the 50th percent, the median of all our peers, if we spend, and it's up to you to figure out how many dollars, to fix these 10 things that our security program is lacking in. So giving you the tools to start to manage up to, or measure and report up to the board. You can also look at it from the perspective of, again, we've got, for example, Alphabet Corporation. We sort of break it down into their different business units. We do the same for anybody, right? So it's already pre-existing. So you can actually look and find out which of your business units are dragging you down. So here we see Cybersecurity Lab is our worst offender, and it kind of goes down the chain from here. As well as, if you wanted to look at it a little more tactically, how can I just get my rating up? Because a lot of times you just want to be the hero, right? Get some quick wins. So in this case, if I can stop Cybersecurity Inc.'s botnet infections, I'm going to go from, I'm at a 530 right now to somewhere along the range of 570 to 580. And then if I get rid of the botnet infections in the lab, which is kind of silly, so I'd probably remove the lab from this equation, you can get more. So it gives you sort of a different way of looking at things. And then there's a ton of other metrics that you can look at. So you can look at, for example, the top left is your SSL configurations over time. Are you improving in the bad findings over the good findings? Or in other words, are you improving over the good findings over the bad findings? Bottom left, how many botnet infections and adware and spyware infections do I have over time? So there's a lot of ways to slice and dice the data. So once you've got the data, reporting is pretty easy. And then finally, looking at things like how do you manage, for operations, how am I comparing week over week, month over month, year over year, quarter over quarter, compared to how I was doing before. So do I see a good trend? Do I see a bad trend? And then we also see some of our customers reporting to the board and things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is the bottom left here. So where was I last month or last quarter? Where am I this quarter? As well as, as I pointed out, your security posture is not just you, it's also your entire vendor ecosystem. So as I look toward the right-hand side, I'm showing how I'm managing my vendors and hopefully I'm improving their rating. So maybe I started out with a 690 last quarter, and now my portfolio of vendors is 710, which means I'm actively working with them. They're working in our best interest, and our risk is lowering as a consequence of interacting with those vendors. So that's kind of my 20,000-foot overview. But just to sort of wrap things up a little bit, it's not just about looking at yourself and prioritizing and spending wisely and doing more with less. It's also about managing your vendors, looking at, obviously we talked about yourself, benchmarking and reporting. We actually work with over 50% of the cyber insurance carriers out there, or insurance carriers who underwrite cyber insurance. And I think our data is in somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of all cyber policies that are written. You can also use us for mergers and acquisitions. We've actually seen customers negotiate price, for acquiring another company based upon their cybersecurity posture. So, or just totally turn them down because they're way too much risk. And then finally, we actually do things on a national cyber level where you can look at, on a country basis, all the companies that do business in that country, how much risk they're bringing to that country. So think about NATO and, now there's a lot, all the EU companies, and what's the consequence when the UK Brexits from the EU? What's that going to have from a cybersecurity perspective? So there's a lot of different use cases for this, and I hope that's been useful. I could talk about this for another 8 hours, and I promise I won't. So I'm going to stop here and lob it back to Donna. Can you be my question and answer moderator, and I'll be just the talent who, I'll be the dancing guinea pig who answers the questions.
Of course. Thank you, Chris, for that presentation. Yeah, let's open it up. Does anyone have any questions for Chris? Feel free to, we have a,
I'll take line
about
questions.
the SSID detection.
I knew somebody's going to ask that. How do we do that? All right. So we partner with TikTok. No, I'm just kidding. We do not. That would be awful. But here's the interesting thing, right? When people write mobile applications, they actually get off-the-shelf software development kits, so SDKs. And so a few of those SDKs actually will report back home to the SDK manufacturer. It's all part of the license agreement. For those of you who don't read the EULA, it's in there. Like me, by the way, I've never read a EULA in my life. Basically what it says is, and basically what the SDK will do is when it's in the mobile app, and it could be anything, right? Fundamentally, the reason but what will happen is it will determine which SSID the mobile phone is currently connected to, and then it will report back to its home, to the website of the SDK maker, and say, hey, I just saw SSID, Starbucks. And when it reports back, it gets the external IP address of the firewall, the NAT address. And so it logs those two things, and it makes that data available to people who have a contract with them. So effectively, if you think about those applications, a lot of them were originally made, or the SDK was originally made for dating apps and things that require proximity. So if you're within, I don't know, I've never used Tinder because I've been married for a long time. But let's just say you're using that kind of thing. You want to know when there's a potential Tinder candidate within a quarter mile from you. So a lot of those things are used in that kind of environment, but they have the secondary use as well. So that's how we get that data.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone else have any questions? You can put them in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself. I don't see anything else as of now, but if you have any other questions for Chris, feel free to reach out to, if you've got a contact at Atlantic, or if you don't reach out to me, I can get it over to Chris and we can get those questions answered for you. Thank you again, Chris, for that.